Hello and welcome back to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Alex Jabr. Alex is a paramedic, researcher and educator and has become renowned for her work in teaching first responders and how to support the survivors of cardiac arrest patients. In 2017, she set up the online platform Emergency Resilience, which offers training for first responders in breaking unfortunate news. Alex continues to try and address gaps in existing paramedic skills by integrating marginal topics into routine training through offering bespoke courses for first responders through social media, but also public speaking. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Could you maybe start off by telling us a little bit about yourself? When did you qualify as a paramedic and what led you into education, what you're doing now?
Well, let's see. I started working in EMS in 2003, worked as an EMT for several years, became a paramedic. I think it was about 2008, I was dabbling in CPR classes and teaching EMT skills, but nothing too serious. Wasn't until about 10 years ago, I started teaching with a paramedic program that I still teach with today. However, I'm not as involved as I used to be, but that's when I got kind of thrown into lecture and, doing cardiology, pharmacology, all the skills, coordinating clinicals and whatnot. And I got a lot of experience teaching. And I kind of ended up being a primary educator by default because I had a back injury in 2017 that ended my career prematurely. It took about 2 years before my doctor cleared me back for full duty. And by then we were kind of on the heels of COVID and just fate would have it. And I couldn't get a job. I tried for a really long time in 2020 to get a job. And we were the part of the country that was pretty quiet. And that's not a word we like to use in EMS, but there were people all over saying, it's quiet, it's eerie. Like, why are we so, slow? We want to run a call. People were actually bored. And that's just how it was for us in the first wave. The second was not so easy on us, but I couldn't find a job. And so I kind of went all in with teaching and then with my business as a continuing educator. And that's how I ended up here. So that was kind of my case was a severe back injury that I do not recommend anybody have. So always document your back injuries, even if you think it's just a sore muscle. It might be disc related, even though you don't want it to be. And documenting it really helped save me, actually. So it ended up being career related and work ended up paying for the surgery.
I think it's such an occupational hazard, isn't it, when you do our job? But also at the same time, what a great thing to have come from an injury that meant stops you from your clinical practice. So I think I first came across your Instagram page through another really awesome Instagram page, the Pre-Hospitalist. So shout out to Lindsay. It's a great page. There's loads of good content on there, and you were sharing stuff around these really marginal topics, CPR-induced consciousness, and there was a study called the Aware study, I think, as well, and talking about death notifications and kind of the really human element, I think, of the job that we do. And there's not many people that seem to be having these conversations. You're one of a small group of paramedics to address a relatively seldom spoken about part of our work, particularly breaking bad news. I was wondering if you'd mind sharing with us a little bit about why you're so passionate about this and why you feel it's such an important topic.
Well, first of all, I'll definitely add on to your kudos to Lindsay because I learned a lot about CPR-induced consciousness from her. She has such a large platform that invites so many people to engage in the comments, and that's where so many insights come from. I mean, there is very little data that actually has testimony from providers directly saying, this is what happened to me with CPR-induced consciousness. This is how the person presented. This is what they did. And I think that even though it's anecdotal and you can't make best practices out of anecdotal evidence, it's still a story that's worth listening to. And so being able to be a spectator on her platform and learn from all those providers is always been enlightening to me. I learned so much from it. I learned so much from her community. So I definitely want to add on to and agree with you on that. And I would say, as far as the marginal topics, if you pay close attention to the things that interest me most, they are marginal topics, but they all come back to mental health. Every single one of them come back to mental and behavioral health. They influence behavioral health. They affect our mental health, and they affect the psychology. And one of the things that happened as a byproduct of me getting injured was I continued with my education. So I took about 10 years to finish my associate's degree. I kick and scream through my bachelor's degree. I was finally willing to get my master's degree. And by the time I got my PhD, I thought, well, why not? Let's just do this. So I was a late bloomer when it came to education, but with a master's in mental health that focused on death and grief and bereavement, and my PhD in depth psychology, I've learned to identify, the kind of hidden places that these calls affect our well-being and our mental health. So, for example, CPR-induced consciousness is just a breeding ground for moral injury when you have agencies that are that aren't willing to see that this is a growing occurrence in our population, especially as CPR practices and initiatives improve, and they're not setting their crews up for success by giving them protocols to go off of. So crews are stuck between, do I sedate my patient with medications that could compromise the resuscitation efforts, or do I not sedate them and subject them and ourselves to the trauma that ensues? Because it's not just people moving around. There are cases that have been published that up to and including having full-blown conversations with these dead patients, where they're bringing in the family to say goodbye, where they're holding them down so that they can intubate them while they're conscious. It's just sick when you think about, what kind of trauma this can cause, both for the surviving patient, if they survive the arrest, which they have a higher likelihood of surviving when they are showing signs of consciousness, but also for the providers as well. So I would say I think that the clinical side of things is still very important, and my attention span, can only do one. So I'm more on the psychosocial, human element of it is where I kind of bring forth the discussion.
And then you obviously put together your online training package, emergency resilience, training for first responders in death notifications. Just, it's not a plug. It's really, really good. £30. It's well worth it. I did it and got loads out of it. It really, really, I think, consolidated a lot of things that I kind of felt I was already doing. But it's nice to hear it from someone else who's obviously, you've gone to that level of education. You've done your MSc in this subject. It's great. But in the training package, one of the things I was going to ask you, you talk quite openly about your own personal experience with your mum and the death of your mum. Do you mind talking a little bit about that, and just how has that shaped how you've obviously chosen to study this and become a real advocate for paramedics doing this part of the job that much better?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I do speak very openly about it in the course I put together, and thank you for taking it. I'm glad you found something out of it. I find that it's one of two things. It's people are already doing it and they just needed confirmation to know they were doing it right, or someone told them, don't say dead and died, and they're like, no, that's not right. And so this kind of puts to rest that argument. Or they were never given any direction, and this really kind of helps them, especially as we've got a generation of providers that are coming up that have never had to talk to somebody in real life. If they didn't want to, they could just do it all in an app. They've never known the anxiety of walking up to somebody in a bar and asking for their number. But so that does come with its own set of skills. As far as where my mom comes into play, is a couple of weeks before I started BMT school, my mom died suddenly. And there's this whole thing that has to take place when an immediate family member dies that you don't understand unless you're the one planning the funeral, which in this case, my sister took the brunt of it. She kind of took the lead. She's 10 years older than me. She naturally kind of just fell into place and got things done. And there came a point where she had to start making she had to start inviting people to the funeral and notifying people that mom had died. And I come home one day and she's like, I can't ruin one more person's day. Like, I just need you to call one person for me. Like, I need you to call Debbie, which is our mom's best friend. I need you to tell her that, what happened. And I was like, oh yeah, no problem. I got this. Like, I'm not thinking very clearly. I'm 18. I, think I know everything. And when you stop and think about the skill of delivering bad news, nobody really teaches you how to do it. There is a craft to it. There is, a way that I now teach. But it's not something that we're kind of taught how to do. And so instead of setting it up correctly by, warning her and telling her like, hey, I have bad news. It's about mom. We're not really sure exactly what happened, but my sister went to the gym and mom was in the bathroom. When she came home, mom was still in the bathroom and she was unresponsive. We called 911. And when they got there, they said there was nothing that could be done. And I'm sorry to tell you that mom died. And instead of telling her that, I just went right out of the gate with mom's dead. And it obviously went very poor. And I might have even started with something along the lines of like, she's not going to make lunch this week, because they had plans for lunch for my mom's birthday. And so, I mean, when I tell you that, I just opened my mouth and inserted my foot without any hesitation. That's exactly what happened. And so what kind of unfolded after that was her hanging up because she was absolutely speechless. Her best friend is dead. And her husband calling me back to yell at me for doing such a bad job. And I mean, granted, he was a bit of a jackass, but he also wasn't wrong. He's watching his wife suffering. He's watching her getting arguably the worst news of her life to date. And I definitely did not make it easier. So even though he was, a lot of people get aghast and they're really upset about how he handled it, but he's not an emotionally intelligent person. I didn't expect anything more out of him, but he also wasn't wrong. And so I'm not mad at him for it. And it was really the catalyst for what eventually became what we talk about now, because in that moment, because now at that point, then I'm crying, I'm in tears. It was a horrible experience to be yelled at like that. Quite the insult to injury when your mom's dead and then you're getting in trouble from a type of parental figure, really. I mean, I'd grown up around this man. And to find out, to calm myself down by saying, you know what, I'm starting EMT school in 2 weeks and they'll teach me everything I need to know about how to do it right then. And, if I say that in a room full of first responders, I give it a second because they all start laughing uncomfortably because they know they never received that training either. And so over the course of my career, I spent several years working as EMT before I went to paramedic school. I kind of learned to watch and see that nobody really ever did it. And by the time I got to paramedic school, I had some great, incredible instructors, some of the best. And my preceptors were great. And yet there was a moment where I realized nobody taught them how to do it either, because I watched them evade it as well and dodge the, D word when it came to talking to family. And I wish I could tell you that that was my kind of defining moment. That was my, that was my moment that I decided I'm never going to do that. I'm going to be better than it. And instead, I just repeated it. I learned how to avoid the family. And so that persisted for the first few years of my career as a medic and my time as a medic until the EMS gods kind of said, okay, none of that anymore. That's enough of you. And I kept getting put in positions where I had to talk to the family, where there were circumstances that were very ethical versus legal, whereas like this patient is clearly 100 years old, in septic shock, got discharged home to die at home with their family, and one family got panicked and called 911, and they don't want to give us the DNR. And so I'm stuck between legally, I have to intervene, even with a DNR. If one person says no, at least in California where I worked in the United States, if one person says no, you have to honor the family member. Not even power of attorney. It just had to be one family member. It's not that case everywhere in the United States, but many places are like this. And I'd have to sit there and have a difficult conversation while a patient is circling the drain because I want to let them die. They have the right to die. They're home, like that is their dignity. And it is the plan of the rest of the family. It says here on the paperwork, it says here, talking to the nurse. And so finding that ability to give them permission, because a lot of times they were just scared. They felt guilty and they had to have somebody tell them it's okay. This rattling that they're doing, this breathing that they're doing, it's very normal. You're not doing anything wrong. Here, let us help you make them more comfortable. Let's suction them. Let's sit them up. Let's wipe their face. Let's let you hold their hand. And so I found myself advocating, ironically, for my patient to have the right to die. And it kind of sparked my interest at that point that why were we never taught this? And by this point, I'm teaching pretty extensively in my paramedic program. I'm running quite a bit. I'm very involved. And I thought, I forget teaching CPR. Like I want to teach this stuff now. And so I just created a pathway for myself to do it.
I think it's great. Honestly, it's such a great story how you've almost experienced the full spectrum. You're talking back to that early story, with your mum, and I think we've kind of got almost have these experiences to kind of go full circle, and you look at everything that you've done now and everything that you put out there and all that you achieved. And I think it's a really, really great story. You were talking about obviously paramedics historically not receiving training on having these conversations, and I think that's something that so many people listening will be able to relate to, that that elderly patient with a DNR, and we're stuck with that ethical conflict of, we know what the right thing to do is, but for some reason, whether it's a protocol thing or a legal thing or another reason, we feel like our hands are tied and we end up doing something that we don't really want to do, we don't believe is in the patient's best interests. But as you've perfectly alluded to, that paramedics don't, in the UK as well, traditionally haven't had this kind of training to have these conversations. One of the things that you certainly advocate in your training, in your online package, is that it should be paramedics that deliver these death notifications over, for example, the police, or I don't know, a doctor in the hospital or somebody else. Do you mind just explaining a little bit about why you so strongly believe that it should be us as paramedics that is the one to deliver these death notifications to families?
Sure. And, I'm glad you brought it up. And I also want to add the disclaimer. It is strictly based on my opinion. And, both personal, professional, and research experience on it. No, big regulating alphabet soup agency is telling us to do it, when I wish they would, kind of take initiative and give us that guidance. But the reason why I mention that is, I usually in my in-person lecture, you'll have a slide that has a dozen different types of professions. You've got chiefs and captains and paramedics and EMTs and nurses and doctors and social workers and chaplains and the coroner and law enforcement. You have all these professions that, if a patient dies unexpectedly in the pre-hospital setting and they get transported and they still die, potentially exchange hands with every single one of these professions. And every single one of these professions have death as being a potential part of their job, but none of them get subsequent or substantial training on how to actually deliver the notification. And so the reason why I say it's us is because we were there when it happened. We are the closest point of contact to that person last being alive. We are the person that showed up when the family called 911. So let's say, for example, I'll give a good example of it's a friend of mine whose husband died. And when he went into a cardiac arrest, she started CPR. And of course, being a layperson, she's just following the directions of the dispatcher, the 911 dispatcher, and she's doing the best that she can. When her husband ended up getting transported and he dies in the hospital, what is that social worker or doctor or nurse even going to tell her that's going to make her feel better about what she did on scene? Whereas when she ends up running into the paramedic a few days later, he thanked her for the he thanked her for the compressions that she did. He told her, you did a really good job. You gave him the best chance of survival. Nobody else was going to give her that reassurance and that closure the way the person that she had that bond with on scene. So it's just this immediate point of contact. You are forever going to be bonded to that patient's family member. You're going to forget them by the next day, most of the times. And that's okay. That's normal. They will never forget you. And you have that authority. You have that authority to relieve them of guilt, to reassure them that they did a good job. And I think that the further you get away from that, the less, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's just going to resonate a lot less for them because, a chaplain might just be saying that to make you feel better, but the paramedic saw you and saw your efforts. Whereas if the patient died in the hospital, it's going to be the doctor and the nurse, but I'm talking pre-hospital setting, it's us.
You use a really nice metaphor in your online training when you're talking about this, and it's that the metaphor is when we go to a really difficult job, the person that we want to speak to is our colleagues that we shared that experience with. It might not be our best friend who's also a paramedic in the job somewhere else. It's often not the people from home. It might not be our mentor or someone that we really clinically respect, though we might talk to them as well. The people that we really want to talk to are the people that we shared that experience with, and that for me I thought was really, really cemented what you were saying around why it should be us. And I know you said it's your opinion, but just to reassure you, it's absolutely my opinion as well that it should be us. I feel like out of I think generally paramedics, like we understand that human side of the job. We're working with people outside of the hospital. It's a very privileged job. We're invited into people's homes. We're trusted, and even though historically so much of what we've done has been based on experience, there's an awful lot of people like yourself now that are driving through not necessarily guidelines, but demonstrating good reasons why it should be us and how we can go about it. So yeah, I think it's great. One of the other real take homes for me from your delivering unfortunate news training was that as paramedics, we want to fix problems with actions, but when it comes to supporting families, when we're telling them their loved ones died, it's actually through inaction that we can allow them that space to grieve, and that feels so inherently the opposite of what we like to do. We're problem solvers. We're taught resuscitation. We want to go in and defibrillate VF and give adrenaline and fix something, but it can be really, really hard when you want to say something or do something that's going to make someone feel better, but the reality is that you can't, and you have to, it's exactly as you said, that inaction, giving them that space. But I was wondering, do you have any practical suggestions for people who might be listening who, even though they might be in agreement with what we're saying, feel quite apprehensive about this and feel they might find it quite hard?
I would first, be okay with that. Try not to judge it. A lot of times we will be reactive and get kind of frustrated with ourselves because we feel uncomfortable instead of just saying, okay, so you feel uncomfortable. Why? Get curious about it. Get curious as to why we feel uncomfortable. And most of the time, it's going to come back to one of two things, which one of them is going to be, it's going to be a reflection of our own discomfort with death. And the more we can relate to that family member, the more we're going to be uncomfortable with it. So think of an elderly patient in a nursing facility. We might think, oh, I'd never put my parent in a nursing facility, so I don't have an association with this. Maybe I don't. And I mean, like maybe I would never see myself in this position, but I see this mother or I see this father who's the same age as me grieving over their son. I can't separate myself from that. And I can't imagine what that would feel like to lose a son. And all of a sudden I'm having trouble just sitting here doing nothing because I want to fix it. I'm feeling so uncomfortable because now I'm taking it personally. The other one is I'll ask you this, think back to your training when, and this will enlighten me to how it is in the UK, but think back to your training and how you guys probably practiced mega code or ACLS or cardiac arrest in a station, right? In a skills scenario, correct? Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, absolutely.
When did your patient die?
Normally when you've done something horribly wrong and then it's an awkward conversation because you've failed the sim or the moulage. So yeah,
Okay, so it's
but otherwise they wouldn't.
culture. Yeah, it's when you fail.
Yeah.
When you mess something up. So we've not only, so you got to think about it from like an evolutionary perspective of our industry, which is that we condition our providers to hear a bell, an alarm, a tone, and rush to a scene and fix it. Fix something. If we can't fix it, we take it somewhere where it can be fixed. Definitive care, right? On top of that, we've conditioned from the prime, like when we're students, we are so much more influenced. It's like being a child again. We're just sponges. We will absorb everything you teach us when we're in that seat as a student. And we will stick to that. And we will spend the rest of our careers resisting new things because it goes against our primary training. And in that primary training, we are taught that the patient only dies when we make an error. So then our association with death becomes failure, and we don't like to fail. And then we feel like we are to blame. So we are afraid underneath it all. We might not think this consciously, but underneath it all, we're afraid to face the family because we feel like we messed up. We did the wrong thing. When in fact, people die.
And all you've got to do is look at the data, and it's very similar, I think, in the States to the UK. The percentage of people who survive an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest neurologically intact, these aren't the majority of these patients that we're going to see. It's absolutely the minority. 20 to 30% achieve roster hospital, and I think about 10% survive neurologically intact in the UK. I think that's, generally speaking, matches the US. Yeah, and as much as we all hope and wish those numbers will improve at some point, the absolute brutal reality of it is that more than likely these jobs that we go to, we're not going to have a successful outcome, but yet we've somehow failed to prepare in our training for that eventuality. It seems it's bizarre, isn't it? Not wanting to, exactly as you said, accept and admit that failure. Have you got any practical suggestions in terms of having these conversations? I know in your training you propose like a 4-step, in terms of talking to the family, going back, giving clinical care. Any sort of practical steps for people that are maybe listening who want to be more proactive doing this, but would really, really appreciate some practical tips, some nuanced approaches to being able to have these conversations.
Sure. And now the 4-step process that I teach is when you're having to deliver the notification itself. So this may come up a lot if, let's say, you respond to a call and you determine the person is dead, and now a family member shows up, a next of kin, and now you have to relay it to them. You set them up with, they know something's wrong, but maybe they don't know who it's about. So they show up. Why are you here? Well, I have some really bad news. It's who is so-and-so to you? You determine who they are. You let them know that that you have bad news about them, and you tell them what your findings are. You be very brief, and then you have to use the words dead and died. As far as how to hold that space for the family member, the most important thing you can do, and this is a practical tip, but it's not an easy one by any means, which is to be comfortable with silence. Don't try and fill the space. Their grief is meant to be experienced, not to be fixed. So even though the family member may respond with agony and wailing and crying and being upset, That's grief doing its job. It's allowing them to feel it. And our job is to give them the space to do it. So not telling them, you need to be strong, you need to calm down, they're in a better place, not telling them all these sentiments that really just make us feel better. We're trying to feel better. And a lot of times the discomfort is with us. It's not the family members just having the grief and they don't want to be fixed. They want, inherently, we want to experience that grief. We want to feel that pain because that's where the healing process takes place. So I would say more so it's about understanding the mechanisms behind it and get comfortable with not saying anything at all. There is nothing. Like, you're asking me to give you practical tips when my point is do less. Just sit there. Just sit there quietly and be present. If you remember the story I told about my mom, I never spoke to the firefighters that were there. We didn't exchange one word. My sister is the one that exchanged words with them because of the fact that she was there. I showed up an hour later, but they still had a lasting impact on me because them being there made me feel cared for. It made me feel protected. It made me feel like they cared about me. When in reality, they were just waiting for the coroner to come pick up my mom, and they couldn't release the body to us. But I didn't feel any less cared for when I finally learned that about my system, and that they didn't stay because they wanted to stay. I thought they stayed because they wanted to stay with us. That's the story I told myself as a child. That's 18 years old. And look at what they've done. Look at what they've influenced me to do. So you're going to walk away not feeling good. You may walk away feeling guilty and like you could have done more, but they're going to walk away going, wow, I felt so supported. I'm so glad I wasn't alone. And that doesn't take any steps or any words to be able to do.
You've said that the biggest role that we can have in terms of the stages of grief are to help with the denial and bargaining stages of grief. And I think by being really upfront and brutally honest with it, it's always uncomfortable to be that straight to the point in these situations, but to really the alternative is that families and the survivors of cardiac arrest, they can go into this denial and bargaining stage that can become an endless cycle for some people. Have you got any practical tips around that? I know you've said about using the words dead and being really, really straight to the point, but for someone who's maybe listening, who might be presented with someone who is in just disbelief that it could have happened, or that someone's died, or they're trying to bargain with you to carry on resuscitation.
A lot of time they know. They're waiting for you as the authority to tell them otherwise. And if I can't prove this. Obviously, I'm not there as a fly on the wall on every single one of them. We're not recording these, but a lot of times if somebody doesn't want to accept where it's going, we have to ask ourselves, am I being very clear? This is not working. We're going to stop. There's a decision that has to be made. And I think another thing is that there's always going to be an exception to the rule. There's always going to be someone that just will not have it. And we cannot let our day-to-day practice with this be based off of that one exception. There are going to be some people you're going to do everything right, and they're not going to respond. They're not going to listen. They're not going to want to hear it. They're going to dissociate, and they're not going to receive your message. And there's nothing you can do about that. Don't let that make you too scared to do it for everybody else, which is that the more concise you can be, the better. I had this experience recently where my sister's best friend was in a horrible traffic accident. We only knew it was a traffic accident, and her daughter was killed instantly, and she was in the hospital on life support for the time being. She was going to be pulled off. And my sister was so upset, and she said, what could have hit her? What could have hit her that would have caused all this damage? And so, being me, I called the first person I thought that might have run the call because I knew where she would have been. And fate would have it that this particular person was the one on the call. And so he kind of did his hesitation, like to make sure that, he wasn't giving me wrong information because they were Jane Does. They didn't have any ID on them. And so I had to tell him who they were. I gave him the wrong car because I gave him her car and not the car she was in, which was her husband. So after he clarified that, and I said, I don't want to know HIPAA information. I want to know what hit her. And he said, okay. He goes, I'm not going to drag this out. He goes, she was hit by a train. And just right off, the amount of relief I felt, not because of what happened, but the relief of not having to dig it out of him because he just told me like that. It gave me a sense of peace and respect. And I thought, oh, it's been a while since someone's had to break that kind of news to me. And I was so, so grateful that he did that. And I had to turn around and call my sister and say the same thing. And I had to call her and I got her on FaceTime and I said, you're not going to like this, but I found out what hit her. And I said, this is going to be harder to hear than what we probably imagined. So I set her up for it. I told her I knew what it was. I told her I talked to the person that was there. And then I told her it was a train. And so it's getting as crystal clear as possible. It's not saying they passed away. They're not responding to our resuscitation measures. They are, resisting the whatever. Like, don't use anything other than this is not working and they have died, or this isn't going to work and we're going to have to stop our efforts and they're going to die. Like,
you shared some people's experiences of when they've had death notifications delivered in, shall we say, suboptimal ways, exactly what you're talking about. And some of them, I remember reading them, and they're almost, if it wasn't for the circumstances, it's almost laughable. In terms of the way that they've it's someone has broken bad news and then it's been interpreted, and obviously they're now describing this retrospectively with a, there's a pinch of kind of, almost amusement in the ridiculousness of it, if that makes sense. And one of them was someone who said that, oh, your relative, that they're gone, and the person has responded saying, well, gone where? Like, where have they gone? And it's so true. It doesn't, you can see how someone in that moment, something like that, just nothing's rational. You're going through those processes of grief. You need that really, really clear communication. The other thing that I think that I've certainly am very aware of anecdotally is the need for repetition. Saying the same thing really simply, really blunt, but almost a few times, just so that it really goes in, and leaving the space for questions. It's all really good stuff. I think arguably one of the most important times to be able to have these conversations, and being able to rely on these things that we're talking about, these tools in your toolbox, is during pediatric out of hospital cardiac arrest calls, which are clearly always stressful for the responding ambulance crews, for the families. But there have been a number of studies now demonstrating the importance of establishing good resuscitation in pediatric cardiac arrest before moving to hospital. Yet in many areas of both the UK and America as well, studies have demonstrated that ambulance crews still scoop and run, in inverted commas. Why do you think this is, and how can we go about changing that culture?
because they haven't told to do anything different. They're not told to do anything different. They're told, usually when I teach all this stuff, people in the audience are imagining an adult. And at the very end, I say, guess what? This applies to pediatrics too. And they get really uncomfortable. Nothing I teach is specifically adults. How about our high performance CPR training? It's always adults. These initiatives that are often tied to a study because they want to collect the data don't qualify these patients that are under the age of 16 or 18 sometimes, just depending. And I remember there was one of the most aggressive, forward-thinking, high-performance CPR agency, arguably in the nation at one point. I asked them, why do you stay on scene with adults? Oh, because of this and compression fraction and coronary, all these things, all these great statistics and these numbers and say, what about kids? Oh, no, 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 no. We go immediately to the hospital. Why? Why? But because it's different. So they don't deserve the same chance of survival? Oh, well, we can't, and there's always, because we're not allowed to intubate in California, we're not allowed to intubate pediatrics, as if a basic airway isn't good enough sometimes. So there's always this excuse. And I think it comes back to the people making the rules has never told us, stay there, stay put. Nobody wants to make that decision. Now, when I teach it, and particularly when I was teaching to fire departments, I was an EMS coordinator for my fire departments. I would teach them about pediatrics, and I would always give them this one disclaimer, which is, if somebody hands you a dead baby and the first thing you do is run for the nearest ambulance and go to the hospital, I will not judge you. It won't be the best idea. It probably won't be a good outcome for the patient, but I also understand it, and you're not going to get in trouble. Here's what I need you to try and do. So for adults, we feel pretty anchored by, at least where I worked, 20 minutes, no changes on the monitor, X, Y, and Z has been done, call it. This was a practice that I learned from Dr. Antevi, which is at least get one round of epi, or in your case, adrenaline. At least get one round of epinephrine onto the pediatric. And so I teach them, can you do at least one round before you cut and run to the hospital? They're like, yeah, I could do that. You know what they have to do before they get one round of epi on board?
Go on.
They have to do everything else. They have to get the IO or the vascular access. They have to get the, assess the rhythm, shock if needed. They have to do the CPR. They have to do the airway. They have to ventilate. They have to do all these things. There's all these things that need to take place, that it gets them to ground themselves down and go, okay, maybe we'll be okay for a second round. Maybe we'll be okay for a third round. And before you know it, an agency I used to work for started staying on scene longer and longer. Instead of being off scene within 5 minutes, they were staying on scene 10 to 12, up to 15, and sometimes 30 minutes. Guess which group had BROSC and which group did not?
It's always going to be the second one that stays on scene, and that's mirrored exactly the findings that we've that we found in London. How much do you think inevitably the clinical stuff to one side, there's the fact that people are going to have to also deal with the parents? How much of it do you think that plays into it? And
a whole lot. And people are afraid of parents, and they should be. I know, I've been there. It is the most uncomfortable scene to be a part of, on top of the fact that I do believe, here's another part and another element, and why I don't judge it. I do believe crews will scoop and run to the hospital to spare their own mental health because they can't handle being around the family. And it's self-preservation in a way, to say, you know what, I'm going to get out of here. I'm not going to be the subject of their, potentially their berating. And mentally, it's all I can handle, but to just move and get going. And so I understand that part of it. But you often hear people don't say that. They don't say, I didn't want to be the person. They don't say, I couldn't listen to that mother scream. They say, oh, it was an unsafe scene. And it's like, oh, well, was it? Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's just emotional, and it makes us feel unsafe, and it makes us feel like it's going to get potentially unsafe. And we throw that word out there. And then we're left with this bias and this story we tell ourselves that parents are unsafe, that the second a baby dies or is, compromised and potentially going to die, that the parents are going to attack us. And that's not necessarily fact. We don't have any data that supports that every single time a child is in a cardiac arrest that the parents come after us. But yet that's the story and the impression we get because we keep repeating that. And now, does that happen? Absolutely. But it's the exception. And I always say there will always be exceptions to the rules, but don't make rules out of exceptions. which is what we've done quite a bit with pediatric cardiac arrests.
I think it's easy just to justify, but now knowing what we do, like it's very hard to have that expectation on people unless you give them the tools in being able to have these conversations and actually talk to its patients or talk to their families around the really, really hard, really difficult stuff. But I think that is the real key to doing our job and doing our job well. We
Also,
touched well, go on.
I'm going to interrupt because I want to say this too. Somebody taught me this not too long ago. They were a paramedic. I want to say it was several decades ago, probably in the 90s. And at the time, the community that they served had a SIDS group, like kind of a sudden infant death syndrome support group. And they would have a paramedic, a doctor, a chaplain, and maybe a nurse, I think. But they would hold space and get together for these survivors, these parents of children that died of SIDS. And he told me that one of the most common questions they got, because of course back then they especially, transported for the family to show them that we tried, even though they knew the baby was dead. We transported them to let them know that we tried. And we still have that kind of ingrained in us to do this. But he said one of the questions he would always get was, if you knew my baby was dead, why did you take them from me? How do you answer that?
And it's so difficult, isn't it? And yeah, there's also, similar to people that are doing the sort of stuff that you're doing. There's lots of stuff out there now around the importance of keeping parents and children together in the same way that we would invite families in at the point of when we would stop resuscitation, because it's well evidenced now that really does improve um, survivors' abilities to cope with loss. So yeah, I think it's so important keeping parents and children together. But then, as you said, like there's a line somewhere where, I think people will inherently worry that it's going to get in the way of resuscitation, but actually that's not true. And that's certainly not my experience. I think if you're able to have these conversations with people, if you're confident in all the stuff that we've been talking about, then you can always mitigate that. It's not a reason to not. You touched a little bit around, whilst we're on this subject, I think it's probably a poignant to sort of discuss. Your research has uncovered some specific stuff regarding the emotional impact that death notification has on first responders. By repeatedly exposing ourselves to delivering death notifications, like, are we increasing our risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder? Is that something that either comes up or you get asked a lot?
So they have found, there was one study that was published in 2021 that, not specific to PTSD, but a kind of a good friend to PTSD, which is that 5 or more death notifications in a 12-month period was associated with a 73% increase in burnout. 73%. 5 or more. There are areas out there that will do 5 in a week. During our peak COVID seasons, people were doing 5 in a 48-hour shift. So 5 in a 12-month period. Not only that data was collected in 2017. It's a pandemic away from being relative. The world has changed. The field of first responders has changed. The threshold we have for burnout is much lower. And so, the idea that this was the case in 2017 when things were kind of stable, that's remarkable to me. And now you look at least in some areas, ESO Index published this a couple of years ago, which was that death notifications went up 48% pre and post COVID. So now you have a finding that took place in 2017 and an abundance of more opportunities for it to happen that went up 48% post 2020. What a shit show. What an actual, oh my goodness, no wonder. No wonder we're avoiding it. No wonder we don't want anything to do with it, because it is a self-preservation thing. And I get that. But guess what the antidote was? Education and training. And not just initial education. That study found it had to be repeated and continuing ed. You would have thought that I wrote the study myself for a, conflict of interest, but I did not, I promise. And but it's one I cite often because it's what I've been observing and identifying for quite some time, which is that if you send your providers out into the field without any tools to feel competent and confident in their work, then you're setting them up for failure, and nobody likes to fail.
And it all comes back to what we were saying earlier, wasn't it, about, having the tools to be able to do this stuff. I think we all want to help people. No one gets out of bed to come and do our job and want to do a bad job. But I think if people are inevitably, they're in these situations and they feel that it's not gone well, not been done to the best of their abilities, there's a moral injury in that, right? It goes back to what you're saying about scooping and running with kids. There's the self-preservation stuff. And correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly the stuff that you've put out suggests more that post-traumatic stress is normally linked to a single event, less so around staying on scene, delivering death notifications. That's more suggestive of, as you said, burnout, perhaps like major depressive disorder, these sorts of things. But post-traumatic stress is normally linked to a single incident where there's remuneration. Is that right? On your online training, there's a story of one of your friends, Ben, who met a character called Stabby. Is that right? And
everybody always brings up Stabby. They always remember Stabby. Yes, that's Ben.
It's quite a nickname. But yeah, and unfortunately, we sort of laugh about it, but at the same time, it's horrendous what happened to him. Yeah, what happened to him is awful. It should never happen to anyone. But it's a sad fact for the job that we do, that we're sometimes in dangerous situations or we see horrible things. But your PhD has explored the benefits of ketamine assisted psychotherapy for first responders with post-traumatic stress, people such as Ben. This is, a really, really new, relatively new, exciting sort of field of medicine, if you like. And we're certainly a little bit behind the curve in the UK around this stuff. But I'm fascinated and really interested. I know that you've got some personal experience of this as well. Would you mind telling us a bit about that and share some of your findings and how it's beneficial to patients with post-traumatic stress?
Sure. Yeah, and you're right. PTSD is rarely a single event. For Ben, it apparently was. Obviously, it can be, especially when it's something that life-threatening. But also, if you pay attention to his story, he talks about these other calls that had plagued him and stayed with him that whole time, that started coming further to the surface so that he could work through it with his psychologist. And so he was able to go, okay, now I fixed this thing. Now let's get what's underneath it. And so PTSD, it's very complex, and it's usually cumulative in many ways. But there's one that kind of like, what's the straw that breaks the camel's back kind of mentality, analogy there. Now, as far as ketamine goes, it's really coming forward on the heels of a lot of controversy with ketamine being misused and inappropriately administered to patients in the pre-hospital setting for sedation, for behavioral emergencies, or what isn't a behavioral emergency, but is called one. So that's an unfortunate thing, but also ketamine is a very controversial drug in that it's commonly referred to as a horse tranquilizer. Now, can it tranquilize a horse? Yes, it can. It's used in veterinary medicine, but it was, developed for human beings in surgery. And we're going through this reemergence of looking at psychedelic therapy for mental health. Now, ketamine isn't technically a psychedelic. It's a hallucinogen, but it behaves like a psychedelic. It mimics that of one, as well as the results, which is that it causes rapid antidepressant effects. So patients or people who are resistant to antidepressants are finding very rapid relief with ketamine infusion therapy. Now, mind you, I'm not suggesting, for those who are not aware of it, I'm not suggesting that people go get ketamine on the street or find, a dealer to get ketamine. I'm referring to the ketamine that is acquired in a medical practice, in a therapeutic setting, that's done so to treat a multitude of mental health ailments, and ideally is done so with the guidance of a therapist that can help process the things that come up during a ketamine session. And as you mentioned before, yes, I did my PhD on this. I knew when I started my PhD that I wanted to research a solution. I didn't want to focus on the problem. I think there's a lot of sensationalism around talking about the suicides, and I think it's important to talk about. It's just not the thing everyone's focused on the suicides. And I'm like, okay, what's the other stuff that's contributing to it, co-contributing to it? What's the stuff that we can talk about? Therapy is important. That's here in the center. But in the margins, let's talk ketamine. Why not? Why not let that be an option? It's a lot cheaper than waiting for somebody to go out on a psychological injury and being out for a year and costing the department hundreds of thousands of dollars, when we could just spend a couple thousand on them doing 6 sessions of ketamine with a therapist and potentially reversing all the stuff that would have led them to being out on psychological injury. So that's, a whole other conversation we can get into. But yes, I have had my personal experience with it since then. After I graduated, I did start ketamine therapy, and it had some very profound results. Probably some of the most effective therapy I've done has been the ketamine therapy, but I'm also very clear when I say it was part of a bigger picture. It made everything else I did work better, because I did things like hypnotherapy, I did meditation, I've done dream work, I've worked with a therapist in cognitive behavioral therapy, and I've also I've been on antidepressants off and on. I have not been on them for a period of time. And I really think that all this work, acupuncture was another thing that I did, 5-point ear acupuncture that helps reset the nervous system. All these things I did seem to work in one way or another. I would never say they didn't work, but the ketamine really just brought everything, it gave me access to my subconscious and allowed me to reprogram old stuff that just kept coming back up.
And correct me if I'm wrong, this is how they believe it works, is that it reprograms this neural plasticity almost, where we get stuck in these loops of remuneration and revisiting events. And I know I've read some of the studies on psilocybin, I imagine sound very similar. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. And the fact that, clearly in the States, you guys are ahead of us, where, I'm assuming, I don't know if that's California or particularly where you live, but you're able to access this therapeutically. Yeah, it's great to hear. And that not only is it safe, but, people such as yourself are finding it beneficial. And just sort of on the last question, coming into land a little bit around that, I wanted to ask you, with all of your understanding and research and experience and knowledge around, as you said earlier, this is all mental health within pre-hospital care systems. If you could design the perfect pre-hospital system with a primary focus, so before anything else, you're designing it with responders' mental health and well-being at the absolute center, and then everything else is going to come around that. What would it look like for you, Alex? Where would you start?
So by system, do you mean like a program or the actual company?
So yeah, sorry. So the company, I guess, for to translate, the ambulance service, the company. If someone gave you a blank checkbook and said you're now the chief exec of a new ambulance service that's starting somewhere, where would you start?
So this would be an ethical dilemma that may not work, but if I was allowed to do this, every single person in a position of management or leadership would undergo their own extensive work. That is how you influence change. It's not by, a lot of times I see a lot of these leaders and managers who go, okay, we need a peer support program. Oh, they need to go see a therapist. They need to go to debriefing. Why don't you go to debriefing? Why don't you see a therapist? Why don't you do the things before anybody tells you you have to, and set the standard for the culture? There is a fire chief that reached out to me recently wanting information on ketamine for his members, and now he's doing it. That is how you influence change. Is he goes, I'm going to do this for myself because I need it. I know I need it. And it's going to pave the way for me to advocate for other departments to do the same. But the difference is his intention to do it for himself first. And that's what I would do. Everybody in a position of authority would be doing their own work first. And then it would be heart-centered leading. It would be completely different perspective, because we constantly look outside and go, how do we change that person? With yourself first. But again, that could be ethically, conflicting at times to force somebody to do ketamine therapy.
No, I love it. It's a bit of it's a radical step change away from the lazy boys and the pizza at lunchtime and things like that. So yeah, ketamine holds the answers. What about having like psychologists and psychotherapists that are embedded, all that stuff too? But
now, what I will say is have all those initiatives. Yes, have the psychologists, have the therapists, have the peer support, but have them for yourself first. Have them from the bottom up, top down. Like, how do you create good? Like, you can only teach so much leadership to somebody that hasn't done the self work, the inner work on themselves. A lot of times, the way we treat our subordinates and the way we treat our team members, when we treat them poorly, you could go back and find out, oh, it's because your dad was an asshole to you too. Okay, so that's coming out. Let's fix that fundamentally, and it changes the culture. So yeah, offer all these things. Yeah, blank checkbook would be to have all these things, but more importantly, the person that needs to utilize it are the leaders of the organization first, and then other people will follow.
That's awesome. I love it. I think from everything that we've talked about, tonight, the one big take home from this that I really sort of got is that knowledge is power, and actually the more you know about this stuff, the better, the better equipped you are to deal with it. And so big thank you to you for all the work that you've done, everything that you put out there. And just to say as well, I know we said it earlier, but for anyone listening, I highly recommend Alex's Instagram page, Emergency Resilience, and the training packages she's put out there as well. Alex, thank you so much for coming on. Massively appreciate your time. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Alec. I appreciate it.